talk to you. Um, you are not just a Zen abbess and teacher and a psychotherapist, but you also study the group dynamics and social psychology within Buddhist communities. Can you tell us what you've learned from your studies?
Yes, I've learned that, hello to everyone. I've learned that while we may not be comfortable calling Buddhist communities a cult, they have cult-like dynamics, which means that they have a leader that can't be questioned. They need to abide by the community above all else, above their work and families. This is the most important thing, that the community is very special relative to the rest of the world. And people who contradict the teachings in any way are not allowed to do that and face consequences. So there are many things that are very similar to what happens in cults. Besides that, in cults, they use either breathing techniques, chanting, sleep deprivation. Oh, wow, we use them all. And to help people align with their views. So we have a danger there, and it's very important for us as we join a community to understand that and to test whether or not the community we're in can tolerate critique, whether or not they acknowledge faults of the teacher when they actually occur, or whether they push that aside and drown your voice out. So you need to evaluate each community in which you participate to know whether you are joining in with a cult-like community.
So you start out making it sound as if all Buddhist communities inherently have this structure that is cult-like. And you're also warning us, take a look to be sure whether or not it does. So there is a range of ways that Buddhist people come together and configure themselves around a teacher. So can you talk about how you evaluate? So you mentioned a few things like being able to have criticism, to have questioning. What are other ways? What is
Well,
the range of Buddhist communities that you've seen, and where do we want to be?
Well, sadly, I haven't seen communities, except the ones led by women, that are very balanced in that way. So what we have is, how is the power distributed in the community? If the teacher has the ability to decide your residence, your job in the community, and so on, based on your loyalty to the teacher, this is a little bit too much power. So we need to see how decisions are made and who has the power in the community. Now, I know as a female teacher, I was always hesitant to be seen as too powerful because women are, there's a negative towards powerful women. So you kind of hold back. And I think that's true generally in communities that have women teachers. I haven't seen as much, although there have been a few where there have been abuses. In most cases, the abusive situations develop where there are men. Now, as a psychologist, I wonder how much that is relative to the absent father and how we crave having that paternal figure in our lives who gives us affection and protects us. So I think and most of us have issues. It's like with our moms, don't control me too much, so I think, having a female teacher is helpful in this situation. Also, in terms of the sexual dynamics, we can see all over the world in all kinds of situations, men in power have a kind of entitled proprietary ownership of the women that they come into contact with. So that means that they can have sexual relations with them. This isn't true of women so much. So I think those are some of the things that help us look for a healthier community.
So you're talking about the psychology of that relationship, not actually how communities are structured and permission is given, but there's this implicit.
Yeah, the psychology often affects the structure, of course.
Mhm.
So if we have a male leader who, as we are so blessed to have, it's very hard to challenge anything that happens. So that creates the structure of how the teacher is protected, because there's a yearning to have this father-like or God-like figure in our lives. And so we create the structure of the community obedient to that, and maybe relinquish too much power to that person, as well as the people who surround him in groups, supporting him. Usually, at least in the Zen communities, there are various officers that are in power as well. And they are always supportive of the teacher, because it can't be another way in our Zen communities. They have to be supportive of the teacher, because it becomes synonymous with supporting the teaching.
Mhm. Can we go back? Could you elaborate and give us kind of a dense description of how within the relationship of teacher student or within communities, people are working through issues in their relationship with the father?
Yes, my father died when I was 6, and there was a point when I recognized. So this is the best I can do, is to talk about my specific relationship with my teacher. It was not sexualized, although it might have been appreciated on his side. He loved women to flirt with him and fall in love with him. But in any case, for me, it was the lost father. And when we had troubles, which I know I was the person who fought with him more than anyone else and still stayed in that community. I also had an internal struggle, because I felt like I was losing my father all over again. So for many of us who had issues either with an abusive father, or a lost father, or one who didn't give us much attention, this dynamic comes up. So that's one way of looking at how we relate to the teacher as father. It is a family setting that we're reproducing in the Buddhist community.
So I can think of teachings about the the Lama in Tibetan terms, or Guru in Sanskrit terms, who's sort of, you know, offering protection, offering blessings, kind of offering the psychological security that you would expect. And we're encouraged to see them as a source of refuge and as the protector. So, in a setting like that, is it inevitable that we will start working through whatever of the range of issues we have with the paternal figure?
Well, that it could be inevitable, but I can't say that for sure. I don't know. But I do know that it happens. And I also know that besides the blessings, there is, in our community, in the Zen community, the teacher decides who understands and who doesn't understand. And therefore, who gets promoted, who gets jobs, who gets the best residential opportunities, and so on. So there are actually material things that are passed on because of one's ability to appreciate the teacher's teaching and be part of the community, be a loyal member of the community. If not, you're not rewarded in the same way. And oftentimes, I've seen it happen when I see someone who's particularly argumentative entering a community. Oh, that's not going to work. They're going to be pushed out, and inevitably that does happen. So besides the blessings and the spiritual benefits, there are also the material.
It just occurs to me to wonder whether, in some sense, the psychological appeal of having this father who's perfectly present and perfectly available and perfectly wise and compassionate, in some way hasn't lent to the growth and the stability of Buddhist institutions.
Well, maybe it has. Yeah, maybe it has, in that we do join the community to be fulfilled as humans, be part of a close, intimate, caring family. I know we talked about this as women when we practiced together. We went on various trips to Japan and practiced in temples there, how we were seeking a more perfect family from the difficulties we had experienced.
Could you say how the psychological dynamics play out when the teacher is a woman?
One thing I noticed is that, and there have been books written about this, I can't call them up right now out of my memory, but that men want to distinguish themselves when they're born from a woman's body. They say, that's not me. And so there's a way that men identify as men apart from a woman. And so there's only, where I had actually, as a teacher, I had more male students than female, and that was unusual. But I noticed that they were very interested in the teaching, but there wasn't that kind of clinging and playing up to me that I saw women doing with male teachers. They were distinctly and certainly men, and I was a woman, and they could receive my teachings without feeling like they needed to merge with me in some way.
And how about when they're women with a female teacher?
Boy, I found that to be difficult.
What are the group dynamics?
Yeah, I'm going to elaborate on what I mean by that. I think that it's difficult for women to understand their own competitiveness because it's been somewhat forbidden. In other words, we're supposed to be nice and loving and caring. And so, for example, I would find women competing with me by flirting with my husband. So there were all kinds of difficulties that came up. And also, as a therapist, I have to tell you that every single woman I saw said, I don't want to be like my mom. Now, maybe that speaks to the fact that they were in therapy and there was some difficulties that they were having in their minds. But I think women also want to move away from as we do generationally, move away from the imprisonment women have experienced socially and psychologically. And so I don't want to be like my mom. So there was a lot going on in terms of fighting with a mother image or competing from the women students I had.
Can you speak about the role of projections? What students are projecting onto teachers?
Yes. Well, most of us, I would say probably all of us, have unconscious uh, plays going on in our mind where various people that we meet are the actors who were very active in our early life. For example, I have a sister who was somewhat abusive towards me. And so I'll see her when I meet other people. I'm always fearful that that's going to come out of another woman. So we have these relationships which are very much embedded in our psyche, but sometimes quite unknown to us. And we're looking for those same relationships or people, whether to beware of them or to enjoy them, when we meet other people. So we project from the objects in our mind on the screen of the people that we meet.
And there's this general expectation that a teacher should be offering an example of the fruits of spiritual practice. And so there's a whole set of expectations that come into play that make human failings very difficult to integrate into that relationship.
Yes. The idea of a spiritual leader, at least in my culture, is a man, and a kind man. And it's not so hard for a Buddhist teacher to play that role of being the kind man.
If they're a man.
Yeah, if they're a man. But as a woman, I mean, they are also able at the same time as men to offer discipline and correction, where that's a lot harder for a woman to do without becoming the bitch or without becoming the negative mother. So there's special requirements, particularly from women, I think, who I always found women to be much more complicated emotionally. It seemed like the male students that I had could kind of turn that off a little bit and just focus on the teachings. But it was somewhat overwhelming for the women to be with a woman teacher.
Mm-hmm. And so what does all of this tell us about the work that we need to do to generate more healthy communities?
Well, we need to train the teachers. We need to train the teachers in understanding projection and longing, the longing that students come with, particularly the women who want to complete themselves through this very high male. And so there's a lot of training that could go on. The other aspect of training is training the community. For example, what we find in communities where there's been a breach of ethics is that the board of directors has been reluctant to come out against the teacher. So the board of directors needs to be trained to understand that their job is to take care of the community, not to take care of the teacher. And so there are aspects of, and also we need to train the community, the members of the community, who look for what they get a whiff of. If they get a whiff of some kind of sexual relationship, they need to pay attention, whether it's between the teacher or a board member or something. I remember once I was traveling in Japan, and there was a teacher that I went to stay with. He was part of the Soto lineage that I belonged to. And I saw at one of our meals, there was a woman student there with him. She put some of the food from her plate on his. And I said to the young man who was a student there, is there something going on between this woman and this male teacher? And he said, how did you know? And it was just that, they've often talked about the Princess Margaret and how she wiped dust off the collar of her beloved. And all of a sudden, everybody knew what was going on because of that one gesture. So how we pay attention, and we all have radar for sexuality, how we pay attention as a community, how we understand what our responsibility is as members of the community, and how we're not afraid to come forward, even if it means that we'll be ejected from the community, that it's more important to have integrity than just to belong to a community that is not full of integrity.
One of the questions that I struggle with is whether within Buddhist communities where you have a teacher who's the repository of the teachings, so has a certain access to wisdom that other people don't have, and who is surrounded by their students and has this organization that builds up to enable their teaching activities, which is beautiful because, you have an organization, you can have, you can do more with the same, set of words. But this ends up being an inherently patriarchal structure, whether it's a man or woman on top, because you have this important figure who's emanating all the goods down to everyone else. And everything has to hold that teacher up because everyone else is depending on them.
Yeah.
And when you talk about a board of directors, and it could be the officers or the lay leaders or, the project heads, they have a very, very symbiotic relationship with the teacher's role that makes it, in my experience, almost impossible for a board of advisors. And I've been on boards and I've, negotiated from the outside with boards around abuse cases. And it's, even if on an individual level, some of them may feel moved by the suffering of the survivor as a board, because the organization exists to, support the teacher's activities. If the board is deciding we have to get rid of the teacher, there's no more organization.
Right. So this this view that you've described covers situations where there has been a problem. And how do we prevent the problems? By educating both the teacher, the board, and the community members. Because once it starts to happen, it's very hard to intervene in a way that doesn't destroy the organization. In many cases, it does. Once the board agrees to have an investigation and to support the survivors, there's a loss of membership status. Sometimes the teachers lose their positions. So there's a big loss involved once this happens. So the main work we need to do is to prevent. And it's been very interesting to see that that's not so easy either. I was involved in a situation where I knew the teacher and I knew his view about sexual misconduct, and I knew how much he understood about it. And yet he got caught in that dynamic himself once he became the teacher and was in that position where he was seen as an elevated being. And so that attracts women. So this is another thing that women, I believe, now I haven't ever seen this theory corroborated by any data, but this is my personal theory, that women are attracted to powerful men because of an instinct that their children will be protected. And so there's a kind of longing to have a man in power to protect them and their offspring. So women need to understand the aphrodisiac that power is. And male teachers need to understand it too. It's not you, it's your position. And they don't understand that. And they take this kind of attraction that they have between them and their students as something personal. And of course, who doesn't want more love in their life? Yes, we all do. So they mistake that. They all need education. Women need the education to understand, yes, you may feel an attraction, and it may be because he's a powerful man. And everybody is supporting his power. And the teacher needs to understand, women will do that to you. And it doesn't matter whether they come in and take off all their clothes and throw themselves at you. This is not something that you can allow to happen. Whether you're single, whether you're married, it doesn't matter. I think that more teachers, male teachers, need to be educated that this is like incest. This is like a very sacred relationship that becomes sexualized and is very harmful.
You know, one of the questions that people always have when a teacher that they have had teachings from and found to be very helpful or very beautiful or very inspiring, when they hear that it happened, of course, often it's disbelief because that doesn't match with your understanding. But when people do recognize if they're given proof, which often isn't the case, or if they find the allegations actually credible for whatever reason, there's this question like, how could that happen? So, you know, maybe if it's the first time and they weren't very aware of these issues, which, you know, many teachers aren't. We don't get any training of that until there's a big incident and then we're forced to learn about it, right? My education around this issue came after, you know, friends of mine had been abused and asked me to be involved with their, you know, with their search for accountability. So the first time, okay, but when a teacher who's teaching ethics or holding ethical vows, can you talk about the psychology? Is it power intoxication? What is it?
Well, the power intoxication is what creates the magnetism. But there is definitely a distinctive category of spiritual awakening and psychological development. They're different. And we expect that someone who has spiritual understanding and awakening has developed psychologically. And then there's, of course, ethics is another category. But it isn't always true that teacher who has profound spiritual understanding may be somewhat infantile in their desires and their understanding of other people. Those are different things.
Can you define them and describe them for us?
Yes. So a spiritual understanding, we know in our own traditions, comes from years of practice with a teacher and development, and oftentimes even in spiritual settings, a diminishment of a sense of self or ego that tends to be toxic or overpowering. So that happens with spiritual development. What doesn't happen is a healing of the wounds that person experienced as a child. What doesn't happen is a full understanding of the power of sexual desire. Those things don't, those are part of the realm of psychological development. And they don't always go together with the spiritual development.
Why not?
Well, nothing's perfect. So we tend to talk about, at least in Zen, oh, this is a perfect teaching. Yes. And it has developed over the centuries. And whereas Buddhism and Taoism, came together maybe to make the Zen world. And then in Zen in Japan, Confucianism was added. So the notion of the teacher as the family leader, etc., the Confucian ideology. But in the West, what's happening is that, in my experience in Zen, is that Buddhism is marrying psychology. And in order to do that, these teachers all need therapy. I don't care how enlightened they are.
All right, let's set that up as soon as we can.
It's part of when you enter. It was interesting with one of the teachers that I worked with. We didn't have a way once we uncovered, and this was not having sex with students. This was making the encounters flirtatious and with a kind of exchange of sexual energy, hugs, etc. And when a number of women had complained about this, how they went in to talk about their spiritual experience, the teacher wanted a hug and the hug lasted too long and blah, blah, blah. So when we confronted the teacher, we didn't have anything to do. Either we had to expose the teacher to the whole community over this, or we had to keep the secret, so we thought, and send him to another teacher to talk about this. So we did. We sent him to another male teacher who was pretty well balanced and beyond this kind of behavior, unusually so. And then after that, I think we asked that he get some therapy, but that didn't work either. So this just continued, as far as I could see, up until through the whole lifetime of this teacher, that it was a kind of a smell, a bad smell that permeated his teaching. That when a young woman would come to the door, I would see him light up in a special way. These young women would be given certain jobs to bring him his tea so he could have this private time with them. So there's all kinds of gradations of this sexualization of the relationship between the male teacher and the female student. And of course, and maybe not of course, but in fact, usually the young women appreciated the attention they were getting. They were not yet recognized by their peers as spiritual leaders, and they were getting all this attention from the teacher, so they loved it. And so there are all kinds of degrees of how this plays out in a patriarchal setting.
Well, of course, also the teacher is the one who knows how the relationship should be structured. We don't necessarily, we haven't grown up, most of us, in Buddhist communities. It's a new kind of relationship. We're not really looking at like what's a template and reading what the parameters are. We're learning about it from our teacher. And so if we're not like encouraged to listen to our intuition, we may not recognize this is actually like outside the bounds of what should be happening here, right?
Right. I remember, and oftentimes we can't say anything about it. I remember one young woman, a very pretty young woman, um, who was selected to be a Dharma heir of a teacher. And she was very questioning to the other Dharma heirs. Well, why did he choose me? And those of us who knew just zipped it. We couldn't say, well, because you're such a beautiful young woman, that's why, and so even the community even though the community may recognize this dynamic, it's very hard to call out. And again, beforehand, better.
So speaking of beforehand, many of those listening to this interview on our Spanish language channel will have links to Tibetan Buddhism. But Zen Buddhism spread widely outside of Asia well before Tibetan Buddhism, and also allegations of abuse by Zen teachers began emerging well before the abuse in Tibetan Buddhist communities. Can you tell us a bit about the phenomenon of abuse by Zen teachers and how Zen communities have responded to those allegations?
Well, I do know I did study with a Tibetan teacher, and I want to say that I saw right away the dynamic that this male teacher was dating his students, his female students. It wasn't exactly predatory. I mean, I don't know how many. I mean, how do you define a predator? I don't know. But certainly he would date one, and then when the relationship ended, she would leave the community. And when I saw this, I tried to talk to members of the Tibetan community about this dynamic, and they wouldn't hear any of it. What's the word for, not concubine, but there's a word.
Consort.
Right. They said, oh, she's just a consort. And I said, no, we don't have consorts in the United States. We have girlfriends, we have old ladies, we have wives, we have ex-wives. We don't have consorts. I could not, after having gone through what I had gone through in the Zen community, I couldn't begin to tolerate the amount of permission that the teacher was being given in the Tibetan tradition. And I'm told that this is just a privilege of women who have an inferior birth to be connected in this way to a teacher, to a tulku, was to have sex with him. All of these things that are part of the Tibetan tradition. Zen has been already much more acculturated. I have people who come to me and say Buddhism isn't a religion. And I say, well, it happens to be a religion that I was ordained in. So I think it's a religion. And the fact that you think it's just an idea, you don't understand the rituals or the community that's been built up in the name of this religion. And but our community is made up of converts who idealize Buddhism and who came to Buddhism because they were dissatisfied with their other religion that they were born into, generally, whether it be Catholicism or Judaism or Christianity or the Muslims even.
And so that makes the discovery that bad things happen in Buddhist spaces particularly shocking and devastating, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, because we said, this is different. This is different, and we're not going to have the same problems here. It has a different mindset than other religions. So the fact that people think that way and came to Buddhism believing that makes them all the more vulnerable and all the more crushed when they find problems.
One comment that I hear is, why do we have to talk so much about abuse? What do you say when you're faced with people who don't want to hear about this form of suffering that's being created in their own communities, potentially, or actually?
Well, my feeling is I don't support any organization that includes abusive behaviors, and I won't belong to any. So that kind of limits my participation at this point. But I feel that, you know, our first vow as Zen people is beings are numberless. I vow to awaken with them. It isn't I vow to harm them. So we cannot harm people who join our communities. If there is harm, there's something really wrong with the way we're teaching. And pushing the harmed member, the survivor, aside doesn't make it go away. What makes it go away is when it stops. And so it's very important for us to learn, how did this happen? How did we get here? And what can we do? I mean, as a culture, we're struggling with that. We had Me Too, and now there's pushback on Me Too. And so it doesn't, it's very embedded in our culture. And so therefore, as part of Zen in the Western world, it's very embedded in our culture. But if we allow, well, it's like soup, you know. If you put some animal excrement in a soup, the whole soup is ruined. So that's the way I feel about these abuses. If we harm people in the course of our practice, this isn't practice. This is wrong. And I can't participate in it.
So, Grace, many people first heard your name as a Zen teacher or author, but I first became aware of your work through this informal network of women supporting survivors of abuse by Buddhist teachers. I'm curious to hear, you know, how your own spiritual practice has changed and what you learned as an ally and advocate.
Well, I've learned that this problem is pervasive in the Zen community, and that it's very important for us to study cult dynamics to make sure that what we're doing is practicing a spiritual practice and not joining a cult where we feel that this teaching is the best in the world and has no faults. And I think for me, that's been the most important thing. And as I've said, because of my work, well, because of my work in studying the history of women in Zen, which my first book was Zen Women. And I've said in other programs, I couldn't write that book today. I couldn't write that book today because it's too painful to me. While I could write it about historical women and how they were mistreated by the Zen community, now I know them. And it's personal. And so I find it extremely painful. And that's my suffering.
So, given everything that you've learned and everything that you've observed in your study and in your experience, if we could imagine a community of people that practice together, that shared a set of values and a set of practices and enjoyed the collective sense of, you know, coming together and finding or creating meaning together, what would a community like that look like?
Well, I joined Joko Beck's community for several of her retreats. And I don't know if you know the history of Joko Beck, but she was practicing with Maizumi Roshi in Los Angeles, and the allegation is that he had sex with her underage daughter, which is the kind of thing that would send you running out of a community. And she didn't wear robes. she didn't do Zen chants. Sometimes when we went, instead of offering incense, a few grains of rice would transfer from one bowl to another. She just wore her ordinary clothes. She taught through poetry, not necessarily Zen poetry. And so, and she really worked if someone tried to put her up on a pedestal to say, no, 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 we're not doing that. But let me just say that her successor was the center of a real scandal recently. So it's no guarantee. While she was there, it was good. But then, towards the end of her life, there were problems. So, but that's what it looked like to me. Tony Packer was also an example of someone who talked about the work of this moment and wanted to walk away from the Zen forms, because I think she had a background in Germany and was of a generation that personally knew the harms there. So when she got the whiff of the conformity and the following the leader kind of thing, she just definitely wanted to stop that in her community. So I think being aware of the kinds of dynamics that emerge with teachers and students, and the students revert, as you talked about, to projection and an infantile relationship with the teacher and the community. We need to be educated to that and to look for people who are genuine and not people who hide behind these forms.
All right, let's look for them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grace.
Be together with you.